The morning of July 8th, 1944, Hauptmann Werner Hoffmann stood in what remained of a Norman stone farmhouse 3 kilometers south of St. Lo, listening to a sound that shouldn't exist. Through the shattered window, past the apple orchard reduced to splinters, he could hear them. American guns, not the sporadic fire of an artillery battery conserving ammunition, not the careful, plotted barrages he'd learned to time and evade on the Eastern Front. This was different. This was continuous, a rolling thunder that hadn't stopped for 6 hours. Hoffmann commanded the 2nd Company of the 915th Grenadier Regiment, or what was left of it. 3 days ago, his company numbered 132 men. This morning, he could account for 68. The others weren't all dead. Some were wounded, evacuated to aid stations that no longer existed. Others had simply vanished during the night, buried in the earth by shells that arrived without warning, from guns they never saw. He checked his watch. 0800 hours. The barrage had begun at 0200. 6 hours. He tried to calculate how many shells that represented and gave up. Thousands, certainly. Perhaps tens of thousands. The mathematics didn't matter. What mattered was that his men were still alive, and the Americans hadn't advanced yet. When they did advance, when their infantry finally came walking through that barrage, his company would have to stop them with whatever strength remained. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. Hoffmann had been a soldier since 1939. He'd fought in Poland, where artillery meant a few hours of preparation before the panzers rolled. He'd fought in France in 1940, where the campaign moved so quickly that artillery barely mattered. And he'd spent 2 years in Russia, where he'd learned what real war looked like, where he'd learned that artillery could kill you just as dead as a bullet, maybe deader because you never saw it coming and your body might never be found. But this was something else entirely. This was industrial. This was America. 3 days earlier, Hoffmann's battalion commander, Major Erich Kessler, had called his company commanders to a meeting in a cellar that served as battalion headquarters. Kessler was 41 years old, a veteran of the First War who'd returned to service in 1939. He was methodical, professional, and increasingly worried. "Gentlemen," Kessler had said, spreading a map across a makeshift table, "the Americans are preparing another push. Intelligence suggests they'll strike here along our sector within 72 hours. He'd pointed to the map. The front line ran in jagged pencil marks across Norman countryside that looked deceptively peaceful in the cartography. "Our orders are to hold. The Führer has decreed that every meter of French soil must be defended. Normandy is where we will break the Allied invasion, here in the Bocage, where their tanks cannot maneuver and their air superiority means less in this weather. We will hold until the reserve panzers arrive, until the wonder weapons change the balance, until the political situation shifts." Hoffmann had heard these promises before. On the Eastern Front, they'd waited for reinforcements that never came, for wonder weapons that arrived too late or not at all, for political solutions that existed only in the minds of men in Berlin who hadn't seen a battlefield in years. "What are our ammunition allocations?" Hoffmann had asked. It was the question that mattered. Everything else was tactics and terrain, but tactics meant nothing if the guns went silent. Kessler had hesitated. 10 rounds per gun per day for the field pieces, 15 for the mortars. The room had gone quiet. 10 rounds per gun per day. Hoffmann did mathematics. His company was supported by a battery of 4 10.5-centimeter howitzers. 4 guns, 10 rounds each. 40 shells per day to support a frontline company facing an American division. It was absurd. It was suicide. It was the reality of the Wehrmacht in France in the summer of 1944. "And the Americans?" Hoffmann had asked, though he already knew the answer. "Intelligence suggests considerably more," Kessler had said carefully. "Perhaps 50 rounds per gun per day. Perhaps more. The reports vary. Some prisoners claim their batteries fire whenever requested, that they've never been told to conserve ammunition, that they simply fire. Simply fire." The phrase had stuck with Hoffmann. Simply fire. as if ammunition were air, as if shells grew on trees, as if the industrial capacity to produce and ship and distribute artillery ammunition across an ocean and onto a battlefield were an infinite resource. Of course, he knew it wasn't infinite. Nothing was infinite. But the Americans acted like it was. They acted like they could afford to spend 1,000 shells to kill one German soldier, to destroy one farmhouse, to suppress one machine gun position. And maybe they could afford it. Maybe that was the point. Now, standing in the farmhouse as the barrage continued, Hoffman understood what Kessler had been trying to tell them. The Americans didn't fight like Europeans. They didn't conserve and calculate and carefully husband their resources. They simply brought so many resources that conservation became irrelevant. Lieutenant Paul Richter, his second-in-command, appeared in the doorway. Richter was 23 years old, too young to remember the First War, young enough to have believed all the promises about the new order and German superiority. He looked 10 years older than he had a week ago. Herr Hauptmann, 3rd Platoon reports they're down to 8 men. The cellar on the eastern position took a direct hit. They pulled out 2 wounded. The rest, Richter made a helpless gesture. Put the survivors with the 2nd Platoon, Hoffman said. Consolidate the position. How's our ammunition? For the small arms, we're adequate. For the Panzerfausts, we have 12 left. For the mortars, Richter paused. We fired our allocation yesterday. Battalion says they'll try to get us more tonight, if the supply convoy makes it through. If the supply convoy makes it through. That was always the question now. The roads were death traps during daylight, carpeted with bombs from American planes that appeared whenever the clouds broke. The convoys ran at night, without lights, drivers navigating by memory and prayer. Sometimes they made it, sometimes they didn't. And when they did make it, they brought ammunition measured in handfuls, not trainloads. Hoffman moved to the window. Through the morning haze and the smoke of explosions, he could see very little. The orchard was gone. The stone wall that had marked the property boundary existed only as scattered rubble. The road that had run past the farmhouse had been cratered so thoroughly that it no longer resembled a road at all. It looked like the surface of the moon, if the moon were made of Norman mud and shattered limestone. And somewhere beyond that devastation, beyond the curtain of artillery fire, the Americans were gathering. Infantry in clean uniforms, carrying weapons that worked, fed on rations that actually contained food, supported by tanks that had fuel, protected by planes that owned the sky, and backed by artillery that never seemed to run out of shells. It was the artillery that terrified him most, not the planes, though they were deadly, not the tanks, though they were numerous, the artillery. Because artillery was impersonal. Artillery meant you could die without ever seeing the enemy, without ever having a chance to fight back. You could be the best soldier in the Wehrmacht, the most skilled, the most dedicated, and an American shell could erase you from existence without you ever firing a shot. They're adjusting fire, Richter said, listening to the pattern of explosions. Creeping the barrage north. They're getting ready to advance. Hoffman nodded. He'd seen this before. The Americans had a method. They would saturate an area with artillery. Then they would advance, with their artillery lifting just ahead of their infantry. If you stayed in your position, the shells killed you. If you emerged to fight the infantry, you were in the open when the next barrage fell. It was mathematically elegant and practically devastating. Sound the alert, Hoffman said. Get the men to their positions, fix bayonets, and tell them to make every shot count. The Americans will give us 1 chance, maybe 2. After that, we'll be overrun or dead. Probably both. Richter saluted and left. Hoffman remained at the window, watching the barrage walk northward, watching his world systematically destroyed by an enemy who had so much that they could afford to waste it. He thought about the stories he'd heard. German prisoners who'd been taken during the fighting in North Africa had returned from American captivity in Britain with wild tales. They'd described depots the size of towns, filled with supplies, ammunition stacked in mountains, food in such abundance that even prisoners ate better than German frontline troops. It had seemed like propaganda, like exaggeration, designed to demoralize. But standing here, listening to 6 hours of continuous artillery fire that showed no signs of diminishing, Hoffman wondered if those stories had been true after all. The barrage lifted suddenly. The silence was shocking. After 6 hours of thunder, the absence of sound felt wrong, unnatural. Hoffman's ears rang. He could hear his own heartbeat, loud in the sudden quiet. "They're coming!" someone shouted, and they were. Through the smoke and the morning light, Hoffman could see them. American infantry, advancing in skirmish lines, not running, walking, confident, rifles at the ready. Behind them, tanks, Sherman tanks, smaller than the German panzers, but so many of them, 10, 15, 20, more than Hoffman could count quickly. "Open fire," he ordered. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, muted by 6 hours of barrage. His men opened fire. Machine guns chattered, rifles cracked. For a moment, it felt like a real fight, like the old days when battles were decided by the courage of men and the quality of their weapons. German soldiers were still the best trained in the world. His men were veterans, survivors. They knew their business. The Americans took casualties. Men fell. The others went to ground, seeking cover that barely existed. This should have been the moment when the German defenses prevailed, when superior training and defensive positions won the day. But then, the American artillery spoke again. Not the general barrage from before. Something new, something worse. Hoffman heard a sound like a freight train, growing louder, coming closer. Then, the world exploded. Later, he would learn the Americans called it time on target, a coordination technique where multiple batteries calculated their fires so that shells from different guns at different ranges all arrived at the target simultaneously. No warning. No first round to tell you to take cover. Just instant, overwhelming violence. The farmhouse ceased to exist. One moment, Hoffman was standing at the window. The next, he was on his back in what had been the cellar, his ears bleeding, his vision blurred, buried under rubble. He couldn't remember the transition. The shells had simply erased several seconds from his existence. He tried to move and discovered his left leg wouldn't respond. He looked down and saw blood. Lots of it, though he couldn't feel pain yet. The shock was too great. His body hadn't caught up to what had happened. Someone was screaming. Richter, maybe. Or maybe it was him. The sound was too distorted to tell. He tried to count how long the barrage lasted and couldn't. Time had become meaningless. There was only noise and pressure and the conviction that each shell would be the one that killed him, that this moment, this second, was when he would cease to exist. And then again, silence. Hoffman tried to breathe and found his chest constricted. A beam had fallen across him, pinning him partially. He could see daylight through a gap in the rubble above. Through that gap, he could see smoke and dust, and beyond that, nothing. The world, beyond this hole, had been transformed into something unrecognizable. Footsteps. Someone was walking through the rubble. American footsteps, he thought, though he couldn't say how he knew. Maybe it was the rhythm. Maybe it was the confidence. German soldiers didn't walk like that anymore. Not in France, not in 1944. A face appeared in the gap above. An American soldier, young, no older than Richter. He had his rifle ready, pointed down at Hoffman. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, the American called out something in English, and more faces appeared. They pulled him from the rubble with surprising gentleness, laid him on a stretcher. One of them gave him water. Another began working on his leg, applying a tourniquet with practiced efficiency. They didn't speak German, and he didn't speak English, but they didn't need to. The war for Hoffman was over. As they carried him toward the American lines, past positions that no longer existed, past guns that had been reduced to scrap metal, past bodies that would never be identified, Hoffman had a single, coherent thought. It wasn't about ideology or duty or fatherland. It was simpler than that. How do you fight an enemy who has so much that they don't have to conserve anything? How do you win when your 10 rounds per day faces their unlimited fire? How do you defeat an industrial power that treats artillery ammunition the way you treat air, as if it's simply there, unlimited, free? The mathematics were clear. Germany couldn't win this war. Not against this. Not against an enemy who could afford to fire 1,000 shells to kill one man and then do it again tomorrow and the next day and the next day until every German soldier was dead or captured. The equation didn't balance. It never had. They'd just been too proud or too indoctrinated or too afraid to admit it. A month later, in a British hospital ward, Hoffmann would meet other German prisoners, men from different units, different battles, different parts of France. They all told versions of the same story. American artillery that never stopped, American supplies that never ran out, American soldiers who advanced not because they were better fighters, but because they could afford to trade shells for lives and still come out ahead. One prisoner, a former artillery officer from an elite panzer unit, put it most clearly. I commanded a battery of 4 guns. On a good day, with priority supply, we might fire 200 rounds. The American battery opposite us fired 2,000 every single day. I know because I counted the explosions until I couldn't count anymore. That's not a battle. That's mathematics. And the mathematics say, we've already lost. Hoffmann agreed. The mathematics did say they'd lost. The question was how many more German soldiers would die before everyone else figured out the same equation, before the men in Berlin accepted what was obvious to anyone who'd faced American artillery in Normandy, that you couldn't defeat an enemy who had 10 times your resources by fighting twice as hard. That courage and training and defensive positions meant nothing when the other side could simply bury you under a mountain of steel. The summer of 1944 continued. The Americans broke out of Normandy. Paris fell. The Allied armies raced across France. And every step of the way, American artillery led the advance. Not because American artillerymen were better than German gunners, though they were good, but because they had something the Germans didn't have and couldn't match. They had enough ammunition to simply overwhelm any position, to destroy any defense, to break any line. The German army had been built on the concept of blitzkrieg, lightning war, fast-moving mechanized forces that could strike before the enemy could respond. It had worked in Poland and France and the opening stages of Russia, but that kind of warfare required fuel and spare parts and the industrial capacity to replace losses. By 1944, Germany had none of those things. Germany had soldiers, brave and skilled, and guns, effective and well-designed. But it didn't have enough bullets for those guns or fuel for those tanks or pilots for those planes. America had all of it. America had so much that they could afford to waste it, could afford to fire 100 shells when 10 might do, could afford to replace a damaged tank rather than repair it, could afford to train pilots with 200 hours of flight time, while German pilots went into combat with 50. The numbers told the story. By the end of 1944, American forces in Europe were spending approximately 15 tons of ammunition per day per 10,000 men. German forces were spending 13.8 tons, which seems comparable until you realize the Germans were scraping together every shell they could find while the Americans were firing whenever they felt like it. The Americans could have fired more but didn't need to. The Germans would have fired more but couldn't. General Patton, commanding the American Third Army, would later say, "I don't have to tell you who won the war. You know, the artillery did." He was right, not because American artillery was particularly innovative or clever, but because American artillery had something that trumped innovation and cleverness, abundance. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The reality of American artillery superiority hadn't emerged overnight. It was the product of industrial capacity, tactical innovation, and a fundamental philosophical difference in how Americans approached warfare compared to their German opponents. In the fall of 1941, even before Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, the United States Army was already rethinking artillery. Officers at Fort Sill, the Army's artillery school in Oklahoma, had studied reports from Spain's Civil War and the opening years of the European conflict. They'd identified a problem that would haunt every army in modern war. By the time artillery shells arrived at a target, the enemy had already taken cover. The solution they developed was called time on target, or TOT. The concept was mathematically elegant. Instead of having batteries fire sequentially, each adjusting based on the impacts of shells before them All guns would fire simultaneously with their shells timed to arrive at exactly the same moment. The first warning the enemy would receive would be when dozens or hundreds of shells exploded in the same instant. To make TOT work required three things. First, extremely accurate maps with precise grid coordinates. Second, excellent communications between forward observers, fire direction centers, and the guns themselves. Third, and most critically, enough ammunition that batteries could fire whenever a target appeared rather than carefully hoarding shells. Germany had the first two. German maps were excellent. German communications were adequate, at least early in the war, but they never had the third component. German artillery operated under scarcity from the beginning. Even in 1941, during the invasion of Russia, when the Wehrmacht was at its most powerful, ammunition shortages plagued operations. By late that year, heavy artillery units typically had about 50 rounds per gun on hand. Total. Not per day. Total. Compare that to American practice. An American artillery battery in France in 1944 would typically carry 200 rounds per gun as a basic load, with thousands more rounds available at battalion and division ammunition points. Forward observers could call for fire, knowing the shells would come. Battery commanders didn't have to ask permission or check allocation tables. They simply fired. This created a tactical revolution. German artillery, and Soviet artillery for that matter, relied heavily on pre-planned fires. Surveyors would carefully measure positions, staff officers would plot target areas, batteries would prepare firing data in advance. This worked well for set-piece battles, where the enemy's positions were known and static. It worked poorly for fluid combat, where targets appeared and disappeared quickly. American artillery, by contrast, could respond to emerging targets within minutes. A forward observer spotted a German position. He called it in on the radio, providing grid coordinates. The Fire Direction Center calculated firing data using pre-prepared tape measures that encoded all the necessary ballistic information. The guns fired. From call to impact, 3 minutes. The system was so flexible that any battery in range could fire for any unit. During the Battle of Mortain in August 1944, when German forces launched a counterattack attempting to cut off American forces, a single forward observer in a light observation plane called in fire from 5 different Corps-level artillery battalions in 1 hour. Hundreds of guns from different units, all firing on targets identified by one man in an airplane. No other army could do this. The Germans tried to implement similar systems but lacked both the communications equipment and, critically, the ammunition. Japanese artillery was even more limited. Soviet artillery had the ammunition but lacked the coordination. Only the Americans combined all the necessary elements: maps, communications, training, and enough shells that quantity became its own quality. Colonel Hans von Luck, commanding a Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion in Normandy, captured an American supply depot during the Kasserine Offensive in North Africa in 1943. What he found there shocked him. Mountains of supplies, crates of ammunition stacked 3 meters high, barrels of fuel, spare parts for vehicles, medical supplies, food, all in quantities his entire division hadn't seen in months. In his memoir, von Luck wrote, "The depot contained more supplies than my entire division had on hand, and this was just one depot supporting one American division in a secondary theater. I reported this to my superiors. The Americans fought with a logistical abundance that suggested industrial capacity far beyond German intelligence estimates. If this was what they could do in Africa, what would they do in France?" The answer came in Normandy. By the end of July 1944, 1 month after D-Day, the Allies were landing 30,000 tons of supplies per day across the Normandy beaches. Artillery ammunition made up a substantial portion of that total. American divisions were firing 52.3 tons of ammunition per day. Compare that to German divisions, 16.2 tons per day. And the German figure includes everything scraped together from captured French, Soviet, and Czech stocks. Standard German artillery pieces were firing ammunition manufactured in half a dozen countries, each with slightly different specifications, each requiring different firing tables. The logistical nightmare this created cannot be overstated. A German artillery battery might have guns from Krupp, Skoda and Schneider, all the same caliber, but not quite identical. Getting the right ammunition to the right gun, with the right firing tables when your supply system was under constant air attack and your transportation consisted largely of horse-drawn wagons, was nearly impossible. The Americans, by contrast, had standardized everything. The M101 howitzer was the M101. Every battery had the same guns. Every gun fired the same ammunition. Every forward observer knew exactly what fires to expect. When you called for artillery support from an American artillery battalion, you knew you get 12 guns firing 105mm shells with a specific range and blast radius. The predictability allowed for precise planning. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel commented during the Italian campaign, "The enemy's tremendous superiority in artillery, and even more in the air, has broken the front open." During the Normandy campaign, he added, "Also in evidence is their great superiority in artillery and outstandingly large supply of ammunition." This from the man who'd commanded in North Africa, who'd seen desert warfare where artillery was critical. If Rommel said American artillery was superior, it was superior. But Rommel was speaking to more than just numbers. Yes, the Americans had more guns. Yes, they had more shells. But what really mattered was how they used them. American artillery doctrine emphasized flexibility and speed. German doctrine emphasized precision and conservation. When ammunition is scarce, you shoot carefully. When ammunition is abundant, you shoot often. The Americans shot often. During the fighting for Hill 192 outside St. Lo, the 2nd Infantry Division alone fired up to 20 time-on-target missions per night just to keep German defenders off balance, not to destroy specific targets, just to prevent the Germans from sleeping, from moving, from concentrating. Harassment fire, they called it. Fire designed not to kill, but to degrade the enemy's ability to function. German prisoners frequently remarked on this. Interrogators in France noted that captured German soldiers almost universally cited American artillery as their primary concern. Not tanks, not aircraft, artillery. They'd learned that American positions came with artillery support, that attacking Americans meant facing artillery fire, that even retreating from Americans meant artillery fire following you back to your own lines. One interrogation report from August 1944 quotes a German sergeant, "We were told the Americans were soft, that they relied on equipment because they lacked fighting spirit. This is nonsense. The Americans use artillery the way we use rifles. They don't aim carefully and fire once. They point in your general direction and empty the magazine, except their magazines are never empty. The shells keep coming until we're dead or surrendered. How do you fight that?" The answer, as Germany discovered, was that you didn't. You couldn't. Not with conventional tactics, not with superior training or better tanks or more dedicated soldiers, because none of those things mattered when the other side could bury you under enough high explosive that survival became a matter of luck rather than skill. The disparity became even clearer during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. Hitler's last major offensive in the West, launched through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg, initially achieved surprise. German forces, supported by 1,600 artillery pieces, launched a massive barrage at 0530 on December 16th. The Americans, caught off guard in a supposedly quiet sector, reeled backward. For the first few days, it looked like the German offensive might succeed. They'd achieved surprise. They'd concentrated their forces. They'd punched through American lines. But then American artillery entered the equation. At Bastogne, the Americans' 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored Division found themselves surrounded. By December 22nd, conditions inside the perimeter were desperate. Food was scarce, medical supplies had been captured, and artillery ammunition was restricted to 10 rounds per gun per day. The defenders were being conservative, not by choice, but by necessity. Then the weather cleared on December 23rd. American transport planes began dropping supplies, not just food and medicine, ammunition, primarily ammunition. The defenders of Bastogne went from 10 rounds per day to as many as they needed. The siege held not because the American paratroopers were particularly heroic, though they were brave, but because American logistics could deliver shells to surrounded troops faster than Germans could deliver shells to troops that had open supply lines. By December 24th, the German offensive had stalled, not because of American counterattacks, not because of tactical brilliance, because German forces had outrun their supplies. The offensive had started with enough fuel for 6 days and ammunition for slightly longer. Hitler had assured his generals they'd capture American fuel depots. They didn't. The Red Ball Express, mostly black American truck drivers, had evacuated the depots before German forces arrived. Without fuel, the panzers stopped. Without ammunition, the artillery fell silent. And once German artillery fell silent, American artillery dominated. At Elsenborn Ridge, American artillery stopped entire panzer divisions. Not American tanks, not American infantry, artillery, just artillery, firing so many shells that German vehicles couldn't move, German infantry couldn't advance, German supply convoys couldn't deliver. The 4 divisions fighting on the northern shoulder of the Bulge were supported by 348 guns and a battalion of mortars. All of these weapons were placed under unified command, allowing them to mass fires on any target. The Germans couldn't match this. They had roughly similar numbers of tubes, but their ammunition constraints meant they had to pick targets carefully. The Americans could plaster every suspected German position. General Hans von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army during the Bulge, later said, "We were told to expect supply shortages. We were told American air superiority would complicate movement. What we weren't told was that American artillery would make any movement during daylight suicide and any concentration of forces certain death. We lost the Battle of the Bulge, not to American soldiers, but to American factories." That was the equation Germany couldn't solve. German soldiers were as brave as any soldiers have ever been. German officers were professionally competent. German tactics were sound. German weapons were, in many cases, superior to American equivalents. The Tiger tank was better than the Sherman. The MG-42 machine gun was better than the Browning. The German 88mm gun was one of the finest artillery pieces of the war. But none of that mattered because war in 1944 wasn't about who had the best weapons. It was about who had the most weapons, who could replace losses, who could afford to waste ammunition, who could sustain operations not for days or weeks, but for months and years. And in that equation, America held every advantage. By the end of 1944, American industry had produced approximately 11 million tons of artillery ammunition. Germany had produced roughly 5 million tons, but those numbers don't tell the whole story, because Germany was fighting on multiple fronts, using ammunition captured from half of Europe, dealing with transportation systems destroyed by Allied bombing. American ammunition was standardized, produced in secure factories, shipped across an ocean without loss, and distributed via motor transport that German forces couldn't intercept. The ammunition supply allowed American artillery to develop techniques that would have been impossible for any other army. The TOT shoot, where all shells arrived simultaneously. The serenade, where multiple batteries fired at slightly different times to create a rolling barrage that lasted minutes rather than seconds. The mad minute, where every gun in range fired as fast as possible for 60 seconds, just to demonstrate to the enemy that resistance was futile. These weren't tactics. They were demonstrations of power, psychological warfare through sheer abundance. The message was clear. We have so much, we can afford to waste it. We can fire 1,000 shells to kill one of you and not even notice the expense. How can you possibly win? Lieutenant Rudolf Weber, a German artillery officer captured near Aachen in October 1944, put it precisely in his interrogation. "I commanded a battery of 4 105mm howitzers, good guns, good crews, well trained, on a priority day, with maximum supply. We might fire 200 rounds. The American battery opposite us fired 2,000 rounds every single day. I counted. I kept counting until the numbers became meaningless. That's when I understood we'd lost. Not because their soldiers were better, not because their guns were better, because they had what we needed most and couldn't get, enough ammunition to win by mathematics rather than tactics." The mathematics were indeed stark. If you fought 10 battles, and in each battle you could fire 10 shells, while your enemy fired 100. You lost. Not always. Not every single time. But often enough that the outcome was predetermined. Skill could offset numbers in individual engagements. Training could provide temporary advantages. But over time, over hundreds of battles and thousands of engagements, quantity prevailed. German tactical doctrine recognized this. The Wehrmacht's training manuals emphasized that German forces would likely face numerically superior enemies, that German soldiers would need to use superior tactics, better positions, and more effective weapons to overcome numerical disadvantages. This worked against Poland. It worked against France. It partially worked against Russia, at least initially. Didn't work against America, because America's numerical superiority wasn't just in men or tanks. It was in everything. Every category of supply, every type of ammunition, every support function. The Americans didn't just have more shells. They had more trucks to carry shells, more depots to store shells, more ships to transport shells, more factories to produce shells, more workers to make shells, more raw materials to build shells. Breaking any link in that chain required more power than Germany could muster. Bomb the factories. American industry was spread across a continent and ocean away from German bombers. Attack the ships. The U-boats tried and failed, sinking thousands of vessels, but never enough to significantly impact supply. Target the depots. Allied air superiority made that suicide. The American supply system was redundant, distributed, and vast enough that no amount of interdiction could meaningfully degrade it. By contrast, German supply ran on a handful of critical railway lines through a small, bombed-out country. Allied bombers could and did destroy German rail hubs, creating ammunition shortages even when stockpiles existed. In September 1944, German forces defending the Siegfried Line actually ran out of artillery ammunition. Not low on ammunition, out of ammunition. Batteries that had shells simply stopped firing to preserve what little they had left. The production existed. German factories were still making shells, but the transportation network was so damaged that ammunition sat in depots in the Ruhr while the guns at the front went silent. American forces during the same period experienced what they called an ammunition shortage. This shortage meant that instead of firing unlimited amounts whenever desired, artillery was restricted to firing only when directly supporting combat operations. Units complained about having to carefully plan fires rather than shooting at will. German commanders who heard these reports must have laughed bitterly. The Americans' worst shortage was still abundance by German standards. The disparity shaped every aspect of the campaign in Northwest Europe. At the Siegfried Line, in October 1944, American attacks stalled not because German defenses were strong, though they were fortified, but because American artillery was temporarily limited. The moment that limitation was lifted, the moment ammunition flowed freely again, American forces broke through. This pattern repeated across France, across Belgium, across Germany itself. When American artillery was plentiful, which was almost always, Americans advanced. When American artillery was temporarily restricted, which was rare, Americans paused. The infantry didn't fight harder or worse. The tanks didn't change. What changed was the amount of steel and explosive raining down on German positions. German field commanders understood this with a clarity that headquarters in Berlin never grasped. Reports from the front repeatedly emphasized American material superiority. Not soldiers, not tactics, materials, shells, bullets, fuel, food, everything. General Hans Eberbach, commanding 5th Panzer Army in Normandy against British forces, wrote, "Our artillery consists of guns from every major European power. Acquiring appropriate ammunition is a nightmare. The British alone have 6 times as many guns as we can deploy, and they have unlimited ammunition while we conserve every shell." This from an elite panzer commander describing a defensive battle where he supposedly held every advantage. The psychological impact of constant artillery fire cannot be quantified, but was nonetheless real. German soldiers learned to fear American artillery more than American infantry. They'd describe attacks where American soldiers barely appeared, but shells fell for hours. They'd describe retreats where artillery followed them backward, where every road became a killing ground, where moving meant death, and staying meant death, and survival became random chance. Frontline German units began to disintegrate not from casualties, but from psychological exhaustion. Men who'd fought in Russia, who'd survived Stalingrad and Kursk, broke under Norman artillery. Not because they were cowards, because human beings can only endure so much stress before breaking. And the stress of knowing that an American forward observer, sitting comfortably kilometers away, could call down enough fire to erase your entire platoon from existence without seeing you or knowing your name was unbearable. Soldiers surrendered, not because they wanted to abandon Germany, but because they wanted to stop being shelled. The mathematics of survival became clear. As a prisoner of war, you had perhaps an 80% chance of surviving to war's end. As a German soldier on the line facing American artillery, your odds were far worse. By January 1945, when the Battle of the Spiekeroog Bulge concluded, any German soldier with combat experience understood that the war was lost, not because Germany lacked brave soldiers or competent officers or adequate weapons, because Germany lacked ammunition, because every tactical victory, every successful defense, every clever maneuver meant nothing when the Americans could simply pause, bring up more artillery, and resume the bombardment. The final advances into Germany repeated this pattern. American forces would advance to a river, German forces would defend the far bank, American artillery would fire thousands of shells, German positions would cease to exist, American infantry would cross against minimal resistance. The pattern was so predictable that German soldiers began to calculate their survival odds based on how long they thought American artillery would fire before the infantry assault. Often, they surrendered before the assault came. Why die for a position that would fall anyway? Why sacrifice yourself when the outcome was predetermined? These weren't political decisions, they were mathematical ones, soldiers doing the arithmetic of survival and realizing that continued resistance meant certain death, while surrender meant probable survival. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, in his post-war interrogation, was asked about intelligence failures and strategic mistakes. His answer was blunt. The greatest mistake was believing we could defeat an industrial power 10 times our size. We saw American production figures before the war. We dismissed them as propaganda. They weren't propaganda. They were conservative estimates. By 1944, the Americans were producing more in a month than we produced in a year. How do you defeat that? The interrogator asked if better tactics might have changed the outcome. Von Rundstedt laughed. Tactics? We had excellent tactics. We had the finest tactical training in the world. We'd been fighting since 1939. We'd developed tactics against every enemy, in every terrain. It didn't matter. When your enemy has 100 shells for every one of yours, tactics become irrelevant. You conserve ammunition by carefully planning fires. They waste ammunition by firing at anything that moves. Guess who wins? The lesson of American artillery in World War II wasn't about innovation or brilliance. American artillery wasn't particularly innovative compared to German or British systems. The shells weren't better. The guns weren't revolutionary. What was revolutionary was having so many guns and so many shells that quantity became quality. American soldiers liked to joke that they won the war by throwing steel at Germans until the Germans ran out of Germans. It wasn't entirely a joke. American artillery consumed approximately 17.9 million tons of munitions between 1941 and 1945. That's enough to give every German soldier, military and civilian, approximately 400 pounds of high explosive each. The Soviet Union used 15.4 million tons in the same period, fighting on a larger front with a bigger army. The Germans used less than 10 million tons total, spread across every front from Africa to Norway to Russia. The disparity wasn't subtle, and, critically, the Americans used their ammunition more effectively because they'd built systems that allowed rapid, flexible fire. The Soviets had ammunition, but poor coordination. They'd saturate areas with fire, but couldn't concentrate on targets quickly. The Germans had coordination, but no ammunition. They could plan perfect fires that never happened because the shells didn't exist. Only America had both. Enough ammunition to fire were never needed, and systems to put that fire where it mattered. That combination proved impossible to defeat. Lieutenant Bob Tompkins of the Ghost Army, the deception unit that had helped convince Germans to keep divisions at Calais during Normandy, was interviewed decades after the war about America's victory. The interviewer asked what single factor contributed most to Allied success. Tompkins thought for a long moment. Logistics, he finally said. Not soldiers, or strategy, or technology. Logistics. The ability to put 1,000 tons of supplies on a beach every day and sustain that for months. The ability to ship artillery shells across an ocean and then truck them to the guns and fire them all without running out. That's what won. The Germans were trying to fight a 21st century war with a 19th century logistics system. We were already operating in the 21st century. They never caught up. By April 1945, as American and Soviet forces closed on Berlin from opposite directions, German artillery had largely ceased to exist as an effective force, not because the guns were destroyed, though many were, not because the crews were dead, though many had died, because the ammunition was gone. German batteries had shells measured in dozens, not hundreds. They saved their fire for targets that mattered and watched helplessly as Allied artillery pounded them without restraint. The final battle for Berlin saw Soviet artillery fire more shells into one city than the entire Wehrmacht had fired in the entire Normandy campaign. The scale of the bombardment was unprecedented. German defenders, veteran soldiers who'd survived years of war, described it as incomprehensible. The earth itself seemed to shake. Buildings dissolved. Streets disappeared. And through it all, German artillery responded with a handful of shells, carefully rationed, meaningless against the storm of fire falling on them. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, American artillery units in Europe had expended millions of shells. Exact counts vary, but conservative estimates suggest American artillery in the European theater alone fired over 40 million rounds of ammunition, ranging from 75mm shells to 8-inch howitzer rounds. That's enough to have fired approximately 60 shells for every German soldier who served in the West, military or otherwise. The factories that produced those shells continued operating. The supply lines that delivered them remained intact. The American artillery system could have sustained operations indefinitely. There was no shortage, no crisis, no moment when American commanders had to choose between firing now or saving ammunition for later. They simply fired, secure in the knowledge that more shells were already on the way. Germany, they never achieved that security. From 1941 onward, German artillery operated under scarcity. Every shell fired was one fewer shell available tomorrow. Every barrage meant less capability next week. The mathematics were inexorable. You cannot win a war of attrition when you're running out of ammunition and your enemy isn't. That was the horror German commanders faced when they realized the truth about American artillery. Not that American soldiers were better, not that American tactics were superior, but that American industry was so vast, so productive, so far beyond German capacity that the war was already decided. All that remained was how long Germany would fight and how many people would die before accepting the inevitable. Hauptmann Werner Hoffmann, recovering in a British hospital, understood this with perfect clarity. The war wasn't lost on the battlefield. It was lost in the factories, in the shipyards, in the logistics depots and supply trains and ammunition dumps that kept American guns firing while German guns fell silent. Germany had built an army designed to fight other European armies in quick, decisive campaigns. America had built an army designed to fight anywhere, against anyone, indefinitely, and to win through sheer volume of fire. When those two armies met in France in 1944, the outcome was never in doubt. It just took time for everyone to realize it. The German soldier in the Norman hedgerows, listening to hours of artillery fire, understood it. First, the German commanders, seeing supply reports showing ammunition measured in rounds per gun rather than tons per division, understood it. Second, the politicians in Berlin, reading reports of defeats that shouldn't have been defeats, understood it last, but they all understood it eventually. When you're rationing 10 shells per gun per day and your enemy is firing 100 shells per gun per hour, mathematics says you lose. Not might lose, not probably lose, will lose. The only question is when. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.